How do you view this, given the moves today in various directions and obviously what are very opposing statements from either company?
I think China's made it very clear that they're siding with Qualcomm. And, you know, the region tends to be politically motivated. I think that they are, you know, they're incentivized to side with Qualcomm. It's very important for them to move to 5G. 5G can't happen for China without Qualcomm. You've got the country ruling on 20 or so different patents over the next several weeks.
Well, you've got 22 cases that have been filed in 6 different provinces. Now, on this one, they finally got a hit, but it's not clear whether they're going to get anything similar in the other provinces.
I would be shocked, David, if the rulings we see going forward are in favor of Apple.
Really? So you expect we're going to see more of these?
Yeah, and I think ultimately it's paving the way for a settlement between the two companies.
And you believe that we're going to see more of them because the Chinese government favors Qualcomm in some way, even though Apple, by the way, we don't need to point it out, is a huge employer in the country?
The way I look at it is, you know, we've got this trade war that's escalating. We've tagged ZTE, we've tagged Xinhua, we've tagged Huawei. This is China's way to retaliate against us by going after America's largest company. Between the two, China needs Qualcomm for 5G. And by the way, putting an injunction on iPhones certainly benefits a lot of the homegrown handset companies in China like Huawei and Oppo and Vivo and Xiaomi. So I think there's a big political element here, and it's in China's best interest to pick or favor Qualcomm over Apple.
Gene, you agree? Is this China's attempt to try to accelerate or inflame some internecine squabbles?
I do. I would put it this way, is that I think that the truth lies several layers below the headlines. I think that Romit and David, I think your perspective here, I think, talks about some of those different layers. But ultimately, it's good to get away from some of the speculation and get at the substance of what's going on. And we talked about some of that. The substance is they're still selling phones today. Separately is that when you think about the opportunity in this, the anti-enforcement tribunal court, that whole process takes years, and a lot of these phones will be gone by the time that sorts itself out. And so I do believe there are bigger things going on at play here around trade. I do not believe that it's going to impact the sale of and availability of iPhones in China.
Well, Gene, just to follow up on that, you know, however this case goes, the stock, Apple reversed higher. And it's been this wait for a while as we get almost a daily downgrade of the stock or estimate cuts or something like that, waiting for the stock to find its footing when the news is not great. Does this represent something important to you, or is it just kind of noise in the back and forth with Apple?
Well, I think the stock action is important because, as you said, it's reversing on negative news, which is a positive sign. I think the bigger picture here is that investors have had, call it 4 waves of negative news around iPhone and Apple over the last, since they reported the quarter. Don't need to go through all of them. But I think what has happened is, to me, it's a classic example of investors essentially taking their eye off the ball. And unfortunately, it's going to take a few quarters for them to regain confidence around some of the new reporting metrics. But ultimately, I think the stock action today and what they'll report when they announce the December results will lay the groundwork that this view about how to think about Apple is progressing more as a services company. I think it's critical. You hear a lot of people talking about it, but it's hard to underestimate that this is a different type of a company than it was a decade ago. And ultimately, I think that stories like today will be viewed with less anxiety as investors adopt more of a holistic services approach to the Apple story.
Romit, Qualcomm shares are benefiting today as well, more so than Apple, up almost 3%. Even when it comes to settlement talks, frankly, both companies are saying very different things. Steve Mollenkopf on our air recently sort of alluded to what he ongoing talks with Apple. Apple has disputed this in court in San Diego. Do you think they're talking, A, and B, do you think a settlement becomes more likely after this?
I definitely think they're talking, and I think a settlement is likely. I think Gene had some good perspective. The one thing I would disagree on, though, is I do think there will be an injunction. In China, there's no such thing as a preliminary injunction. Apple can take it can go back to the courts and say, please re-review this. But while that is going on, unlike in the U.S., that injunction stays in place.
Although it doesn't seem to be having any impact if they're selling all the phones and Qualcomm's saying they can't sell any of the phones.
Let's see what happens over the next few days. But I think there's a very good chance that those phones will be taken off the website. As far as it relates to Qualcomm,
if I can interrupt there, that would be a dangerous move by the government to do that. To David's point earlier about, it's a double-edged sword around the number of people, call it 1 million or so people are employed building Apple products in China. It's a measurable number even for a large country like China. So I think that if we're in the betting game here, my sense is that the injunction will not happen.
And finally, back to the settlement itself,
right,
because that does underlie sort of a lot of people's views of both stocks, but in particular Qualcomm, which would obviously benefit, one would think, much more so, given the importance of all that money they're owed.
Yeah, I mean, the reaction up 3% today seems very muted, in my opinion, because if you do get a settlement, we're talking about as much of $1.50 of earnings boost. That's over 30% to Qualcomm's EPS next year. You put a 10 times multiple on that. I would argue on a settlement, Qualcomm stock is closer to $70 versus where it's trading at today, 57, 58. So we're looking at this news that's broken today, and have to believe that Qualcomm stock here in the high 50s is a strong buy.